the landscape of the British Isles. Some of the most varied and beautiful scenery of any area of comparable size on the surface of the Earth. The creation of a complex and sensitive mechanism fueled by the energy of the sun in a never-ending process of change. Breaking up the fabric of the land, transporting it, and reconstructing it in other places and in different forms. Northern Canada, ice sheets, glaciers, and tundra. That's what the climate of Britain and Ireland has been like for about 3/4 of the last 2 million years. Ice, frost, and snow, and the water they release when they melt have had an enormous influence on the shape of our landscapes. The peak of Snowdon, Wales's highest mountain, was shattered by frost as it stood out above a sheet of ice. The hollowed-out corries on the side of the Cuillin Mountains on the Isle of Skye are the cradles of glaciers. A glacier carved the valley of Nantfranken in North Wales. The Thames hasn't always followed this familiar course. It used to run further north until ice blocked the way, and it made itself this new route to the sea. The Devil's Dyke near Brighton. Waterlogged topsoil sludged downhill in the brief thaws of Arctic summers and carved a great gash in the South Downs. The lower the temperature, the more of the Earth's water was locked up in polar ice. As it warmed up again, the ice melted and sea levels rose. Coastlines were redrawn, and here in County Mayo more than 80 new islands were created. This was all dry land before. If it weren't for the ice, we wouldn't have the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, running down from the castle to the Royal Palace of Holyrood House. Vast sheets of ice, anything up to 6,000 feet thick, have advanced and retreated more than 20 times in the last 2 million years. If we imagine that the Earth is only 100 years old, the ice has been coming and going for only the last 16 days. The last time the climate warmed up was just 3 hours ago. At its greatest extent, the ice covered the whole of Ireland. In Britain, it reached what is now North London. Imagine a wall of ice 1,500 feet high, dominating Finchley. Further west, it came as far as the North Devon and Cornwall coasts and the Scilly Isles. The northern part of the Scillies was scraped clean by the ice, but the southern part escaped. So we've got two contrasting types of landscape in one tiny area. Wherever we look in Britain and Ireland, in the uplands or the lowlands, inland or on the coast, we see the legacy of the ice, frost and snow, and of the water they released when they melted. I'm with Professor David Sugden, Head of Geography at Edinburgh University. So many huge movements of ice, backwards and forwards, over a comparatively short period. Why was that?
Well, this all goes back to the radiation received from the sun by the Earth and reflects the irregularities in the orbit and the tilt of the Earth's axis.
What is that orbit?
Well, the orbital effect is that every 100,000 years or so, the Earth goes through an orbit which is almost spherical and circular around the sun. Then it becomes more elongate and more like an ellipse. And that controls the basic change every 100,000 years from relatively warm to relatively cold.
And are there other fluctuations?
Yes, there are. And one of the most important is 21,000 years. And that's a fluctuation which reflects the variations in the tilt of the Earth's axis. And so on top of a broad 100,000-year cycle like that, you have smaller scale fluctuations superimposed on top of that.
And so there are variations within the variations?
Yes, that's right. And it's more interesting still because you get random fluctuations as well as that. For instance, if you have volcanic activity and there's a lot of dust in the atmosphere, then that also reduces the radiation received by the Earth.
What sort of degrees of temperature are we talking about?
Well, just a few degrees. 2-degree change would be enough to cause glaciers to grow in Scotland. For instance, in the mountains of Ben Nevis and the Cairngorms, you have snow patches, which survive every summer at the moment. A lowering of 2 degrees would be enough to cause those to grow into glaciers. At the height of an ice age, probably -6 degrees. Interestingly enough, I have a student, Tony Payne, who's modelling the growth and decay of the Scottish ice sheet. And he finds it's very sensitive to the temperature depression. If you lower temperature by 4.5 degrees centigrade, then the ice grows until it reaches the edge of the Scottish Highlands, but doesn't get out of the Highlands. But if you lower it just by another ½ degree, the ice goes on growing until it reaches London. So it's a very sensitive threshold between a full ice sheet and just small glaciers.
There were glaciers here in North Wales. A succession of them carved the valley of Llyn Peris from the old, strong rocks that make up the flanks of Snowdon. But that was only a superficial scratch compared with the clean sweep made by the sheets of ice over the younger and weaker fabric of East Anglia. They gave us the flat plain of the Irish Midlands. In the west, in County Clare, ice scoured the limestone plateau of the Burren bare of every scrap of soil. It smoothed and rounded the summits of even the highest mountains. And the ice cut across the chalk of the Chilterns like a carpenter's plane through softwood. All of this ice must take up a considerable volume of the Earth's water.
Yes, indeed. This water is abstracted out of the sea. And during an ice age, the sea level is some 300 feet lower. And again, since the height of the last ice age, the sea level has risen by about 300 feet.
The rise in sea level at the end of one of the cold phases cut us off from the mainland of Europe. The Irish Sea was flooded first, and that's why there are no snakes in Ireland. Later, the North Sea was joined to the English Channel. Lower sea levels during the cold phases affected rivers like the Foy in Cornwall. They had to cut deep channels to come down to the sea. Then, as the climate warmed up and the sea rose again, the lower stretches of the valley were drowned. That's how the Foy became such a lovely natural deep-water harbour. The Kenmare River in Southwest Ireland's another drowned valley. Sea lochs like Loch Moidart on the west coast of Scotland are flooded glacier valleys. The advancing sea swept up huge amounts of loose material and threw it onto the new shore. Waves, travelling all the way across the Atlantic, scoured up millions of tons of shingle from anything up to 50 miles away to form Chesil Beach in Dorset. David Sugden mentioned small random drops in temperature. This frost fair on the Thames in London was held late in the 17th century at the height of the so-called Little Ice Age. It snowed as far south as Ethiopia, and glaciers began to advance again in the Scottish Highlands. It was probably caused by volcanic dust in the atmosphere.
Something not very well known abroad is that at that time a lot of Eskimos from Greenland were washed up on the shores of Scotland. For instance, in Aberdeen, Eskimo arrived in 1700 on the beach. He died soon after he arrived, but he came from East Greenland, and that probably reflects the increasing sea ice in the North Atlantic and the obliteration of their hunting grounds, and they were probably looking for richer hunting grounds.
What kind of effect did the larger movements of ice have on the landscape?
There's tremendous variation depending on where you are in Scotland, and perhaps one of the most dramatic contrasts is between the east of Scotland and the Highlands and the west. The Western Highlands are rugged, they're roughened, there's bedrock at the surface. That's a characteristic feature of glacial erosion, and everything's been modified by ice. But as you come across to the east, you get different landscapes. You get rolling slopes, bedrock isn't often at the surface. And it seems that these are just pre-glacial surfaces. These are subtropical land surfaces which have been preserved and protected beneath the ice.
How does that happen?
It probably relates to a very simple threshold between whether or not there's water at the bottom of the ice or not. When there is water at the bottom and the temperatures are sufficiently high, you get sliding and erosion, and the glacier can pick up debris and scour the rock. If it's below this melting point, and it's frozen to the bed, and the ice moves in a layer just above the rock surface, so you get no entrainment of debris and no erosion. So it's possibly a complete protection, and protection from the elements that you get now, for instance.
So there are two sides to Scotland?
There are indeed.
As David Sugden said, it would take a drop in average temperature of only a couple of degrees centigrade for this summer snow on Ben Nevis to become a glacier. What happens is this. The snow is carried by the prevailing westerly wind and swept up over the mountain. It swirls around and settles on the far side, shaded from the warmth of the sun. If this goes on long enough, The snow's own weight compacts it into solid ice. The internal pressures in the ice eventually become so great that it has to obey the law of gravity. It starts to move downwards. All the time, more snow and ice are accumulating. The ice at the top slowly grinds out a hollow in the mountainside. Lower down, it follows the line of least resistance. It enlarges and smooths out a great valley where before there might have been no more than a little stream's gully. In Scotland, this is the Isle of Skye, the hollows where glaciers were born are called corries. The Welsh call them coombs. They often trap water, forming lakes like Red Tarn on the side of Helvellyn in the English Lake District. Striding Edge, the spectacular hill walk above, is all that's left of the mountaintop after the ice has done its work. Lower down, the glaciers have carved out great valleys like Llyn Peris in Snowdonia. Llyn Peris had its local glaciers, but at other times the whole area was covered with one solid sheet of ice. That's what rounded the contours of the mountaintops. Even Wales's highest mountain, Snowdon, was covered by an ice sheet at least once. But the last one didn't manage it. The peak stood out above the surrounding ice, and frost shattered it into its present shape. Frost shattering still goes on. On Ben Bulbin in County Sligo, water freezes in the cracks in the rock. It prizes fragments off, and the debris flows tumble down the lower slopes. This is Croagh Patrick to the southwest in County Mayo. The same frost action produces the screes. The limestone screes of Mount Eglwyseg on the border of England and Wales form a dramatic backdrop to the Vale of Llangollen. Above Wastwater, in the English Lake District, volcanic rock has been shattered into millions of pieces by thousands of years of frosts. The screes sweep down the mountainside into England's deepest lake. As the polar ice advanced across Britain and Ireland time and time again, it made wholesale changes in our landscape. On the younger and weaker fabric, like that of the Cheshire Plain, it acted like a huge sheet of sandpaper. On the older, harder materials of the north and west, it acted more like a routing plain. Glaciers carved valleys like Llyn Peris. The same with Buttermere in the English Lake District, providing the basin for Crummock water. but it was a sheet of ice rather than a glacier that ground over the old volcano of the Castle Rock in Edinburgh to give us the Royal Mile. Like the other forces that are constantly changing our landscape, the ice does three things. It erodes the fabric, it transports the debris, and it deposits the material somewhere else. Enormous amounts of the substance of the land, ranging from huge boulders to sand and clay and mud, were picked up, carried away, and dumped more or less at random by the ice sheets and the glaciers. These scratches on the bedrock in Llynllidor were left by hard boulders dragged along by the ice. They made it even more effective as a giant scourer. Eventually, the big thaw came. The glaciers retreated up their valleys. They dumped their luggage at random. As the last ice melted in combes like this at the head of Nanfranken, it left ramparts called moraines. Now, the moraine dams in a little mountain lake. The melting ice dumped millstone grit boulders on the limestone plateau of North Yorkshire. They came from several miles away. These cliffs on the Norfolk coast contained chalk. It was part of the floor of the North Sea, but then an ice sheet advanced from Norway, picked it up and dumped it here. The ice built whole new landscape features. These hummocks around Clew Bay on the coast of County Mayo go by the name of drumlins. The haphazard load of luggage in an ice sheet was dropped in lumps as the underside of the ice melted under pressure. Later, when the sea rose, more than 80 of the drumlins became islands. Like the drumlins, the land I'm standing on here owes its shape to the work of the ice. Edinburgh's Royal Mile. The great processional route from the castle down to the royal palace of Holyrood House. It's built on the gentle slope, gouged, smoothed and polished by successive ice sheets. The ice ground its way over the extinct volcano of the Castle Rock. The pressure of the rock on the bottom of the ice partially melted it so that it dumped some of the material that it had picked up on its way and streamlined the landscape, leaving this gentle slope in the lee of the rock.